Today we're going to look at the Consumer Price Index and inflation as it relates to the economy. This is the third of our three economic indicators. A few lessons ago we did GDP and output, which was the first economic indicator. The second we did was employment and unemployment, which was the second economic indicator. And this is being the third, which will complete the trifecta of economic indicators for our unit of study. Before we dive into that, please check over your homework to make sure you've done it correctly. If you have any questions or concerns, please send me an EDSB message and I will get to that as soon as possible. Today we're going to want to know how to relate CPI and GDP and output. We're going to want to be able to calculate CPI, inflation, and real GDP. We want to understand the positives and negatives of CPI as a tool and the implications of inflation as it relates to the output and the economy. Hopefully by the end of this lesson you'll be able to practice calculating inflation, CPI, real GDP, and discuss these statistics and complete all your review and homework. So now's a good time to pause, get out a calculator, get out a pen, a pencil, and a piece of paper if you're not using your notes package to write on. So you'll want to be able to do some calculations as we work through this lesson. So price stability, as we know, is a main goal of an economy. We've studied that in previous units. The economy wants prices to be stable. The economy wants us to understand and be able to forecast and be able to predict what prices are going to be. If prices are going up and down quickly, that is difficult for planning, that's difficult for forecasting, difficult for businesses to run. Think about yourself. If you have money, a $20 bill today, it's going to be able to buy you a certain amount of stuff. But if that inflation happens or prices go up, that $20 bill loses value. It loses purchasing power. And we do not want that to run rampant. We do not want that to go out of control to make things difficult for businesses and individuals. And so inflation is the statistic or the metric that looks at the rise in general prices. It looks at how much are prices actually going up in our economy. And CPI is how we track inflation. CPI is the consumer price index of what people spend on. And so CPI represents a basket of goods. Okay, CPI looks at the spending habits of a typical household. What do they spend their money on? And it tracks that basket. So they spend their money on food, on transportation, on entertainment, on technology, on recreation, on health, all these kinds of things. And so the typical family will spend X amount of dollars on these things. And the government will track that basket, that grouping of items, goods and services that are spent on, and see how much the price of those things go up. And because this is the average household, it looks at that basket and says, oh, that basket has gone up 1%. Therefore, everything now is 1% more expensive for the average household. And what is this average household? The average household is a two-parent, two-child home. And so now we'll take a time to actually look at what the CPI is so we can have a better handle on the imagery of it. The first image I want you to take a look at is on your left. And this pie graph or pie chart is taken from your Economics Now textbook. And this is the Consumer Price Index for Canada in 1996. And so you'll see the big, large green portion of the pie being shelter at 27.9%. And so that's saying that the average typical household will spend 27.9% of their income on shelter. And 18.3%, the yellow pie, on transportation, 18% on food, 10.4% on recreation, etc., etc. And so that is 1996. And so if you take a look at the chart or table on the right, you'll notice that I have the CPI for 2009, 11, 13, 15, and 17, and this is from the StatsCan website, as you can see. If you take a look at shelter, in the 1996 pie graph, it showed 27.9% for shelter, and now it's 27.36% in 2017. And so that hasn't changed very much. If you go down to transportation, it was 18.3%, now it's close to 20%. Food was 18%, now it's 16.5%, etc., etc. Household operations and furnishings was 10%, now it is 12.8%, and that's a reasonably big increase. So this is what the CPI represents. You'll notice that it hasn't changed a heck of a lot. We'll examine what these things actually mean in terms of what is in these components, but I want you to understand that these are the things that the average household is spending on. And it's very important to understand that we're talking about the average household of two parents and two kids. And that might not represent you, which we'll tackle in a minute. But um, the government will track this spending to see how much um, prices are going up, how much things are costing, and how much more do things cost compared to how much your dollars are going up or going down. So if we go back to our consumer price index lesson, we'll look at CPI previously, say in 1996, we could have said, compared to now being 2020. We'll look at what was CPI compared to what is CPI, and we'll be able to calculate inflation from those numbers. And so inflation equals CPI now minus CPI before divided by CPI before times 100%. And so inflation will be a percentage change. It could be a 2% change, a 3% change, a 4% change, whatever it might be. And that's how we calculate, is inflation happening, is it not happening? And so let's take a minute to practice doing this. And so our question is going to be calculate the CPI and calculate inflation. And so CPI for the 12 months ended March 2008 was 112.6. For March 2007 was 111.1. And for February 2008 was 112.2. And in this question, you should take a look at two main things that might give you pause. The first I'll take a look at is 2002 equaling 100. What does this even mean? So this number CPI 100 in 2002, 112.6 in 2008, these are just indexed values, meaning that we're taking whatever number the spending was, 32,000, 45,000, whatever the spending is, and we're reducing it and indexing it down to a base of 100. So it's like a percentage. And so in 2002, we're using that as our base year, and we're making that 100. And so it says that in March 2008, CPI was 112.6. And that means it is 12.6% greater than it was in 2002. And therefore, in those 8 years, inflation of 12.6% has happened. It's very simple calculations, much more easy than looking at dollar values of 35,000 to 42,000 or whatever they may be, right? So we're indexing them down so they're simpler to use and easier to understand. The second thing that might have given you pause was looking at the 12 months ended. What does that mean? 12 months ended talks about understand that CPI is a statistic for a 12-month period of time. It's not a singular month. It is not a singular day. It's not 6 months. It is 12 months. It is for a full calendar year. And so let's take a look more deeply at what that means. And so CPI 12 months ended talking about a year-over-year statistic or a month-over-month statistics. And so if we look at our first time period, so that's red line starting on March 31st or February 1st, 2006, ending March 31st, 2007. We're going to compare that time period to the next 12-month time period, March 2007 or February 1st, 2007 to March 31st, 2008. And so we're looking at the first 12-month period compared to the second 12-month period, a year-over-year time frame. Right? So a 12-month spending to a different 12-month spending. And so this is a full year separation. And so we're looking at what is inflation happening over that full year. That's very different than a month-over-month assessment. The month-over-month assessment is going to look at a much shorter time frame, but still 12-month spending periods. And so the first time frame might be February 28th, 2007 to February 28th, 2008. The second time frame being March 31st, 2007 to March 31st, 2008. And so now you can see that there is a significant overlap in months, right? March, April, May, June, July, August, September, all those months are shared by these two time periods. And the only 2 months that are different are the first month, the March 1st to March 31st, 2007 month, and then the March 1st to March 31st, 2008 months, right? And so we're looking at a 12-month spending period in two different time slots that share many of the same months. And so price changes in the second category, month over month, are going to be significantly less than a year-over-year price change, presumably. And so we're only really looking at the differences in a month-to-month situation of a single month versus in the year-over-year of entire spans of a year. So you want to take this time now, so you might want to pause the video to actually practice calculating inflation. And so pause, and then you're going to want to resume once you've tried it out, practice a little bit. And so hopefully you've already tried it by now, and now we're going to continue on with the lesson. So what was inflation over the last year? And so if we look at the previous values that we've been given, CPI for the 12 months ended March 2008 was 112.6. CPI for the 12 months ended March 2007 was 111.1. And so 112.6 minus 111.1 divided by 111.1 equals 100, or times 100% equals 1.4%. And so inflation over the year, over the 12-month time frame, is 1.4%. If we look at inflation over the last month, we have 112.6 and 112.2. And so 112.6 again was the 12 months ended March 2008. And the 112.2 is the 12 months ended February 2008. And so if we look at that, we see a month-over-month inflation rate of 0.36%. And so you can see that the inflation over the month-over-month is much smaller than the inflation for the year-over-year. At this time, you can stop if you want and do the Thinking Like an Economist on page 208 or 209, or you can save that for the end of the lesson and do it later. But it is imperative that you do this Thinking Like an Economist, as this is going to give you a tutorial on how to actually create the CPI, and we'll give you a better understanding of what it looks like. Again, if you have questions about it, please ask me and we'll go over it. So if we look at this chart here, hopefully it's easy to see. This is a historical summary of the CPI for 1995 to 2014. And so first, I guess maybe gather your bearings and take a look at the year 2002. You'll see that 2002 was 100, right? Remember, we're indexing our base year to 100, and so we're comparing all of our years, all of our prices to the 2002 year. And so you can see that years before 2002 are all numbers below 100 because prices have been going up. And from 2002 to 2014, prices are still going up. And so you can see in 2014, the CPI was 125.2. So in that 14-year time frame, prices have gone up. The 12-year time frame from 2014 to 2002, the prices have gone up 25.2%. Right, that is quite a bit. But this is an easy way to show you how has inflation been operating, how has it been looking, what's happening to the value of our dollar. Because if inflation has gone up 25.2%, my question is, has your income gone up 25.2%? Because if your income hasn't gone up 25.2%, then you're actually losing money because prices have gone up. And so that begs the question of should our wages be tied to inflation? Should minimum wages be going up? Should, if inflation happens to a certain amount, should it go up? So, for example, the teachers and the province just came to an agreement, and so part of that agreement was a 1% increase in wages for the teachers, right? But if inflation this year is 2%, that 1% increase in wages is actually them losing money because prices are all higher. And so it's just good to understand, what do these negotiations mean for prices, regardless of whether you agree with it or not. But what's happening? Why are they fighting for certain types of things? And why do some industries tie wages to inflation to ensure that their people retain at least the same purchasing power as the year before? So I want to take a moment to talk about the limitations of CPI, and I alluded to it briefly before when I talked about the household and the basket of goods. And so let's take a deeper dive into that commentary now. And so, one, the basket of goods may be inaccurate. And so, how could a basket of goods be inaccurate? Well, one, there may be difference in habits of lifestyle. And so, if you remember and take a look at the CPI from previous take a look at the CPI from previous slides, you look at one of the categories, it shows alcohol beverages, tobacco products, recreational cannabis. I don't smoke, I don't do cannabis, and so why should that price change impact my inflation rate or my CPI, right? What if I don't own a car, right? What if all these kinds of things, like my spending habits are different, so why should my wages potentially be tied to what someone else's spending habits may be? So my lifestyle differences matter, right? My culture matters, right? What I do, what I eat. I'm Korean, I eat rice, right? So my spending on rice is going to be far different than someone who might spend more on potatoes or more on bread. And so these things may seem trivial, but they matter, right? So they make sense. The next one is the CPI out of date? And so what do I mean? So the last time we base rated our CPI, it was in 2002. That's 18 years ago. Do we need to reassess what the basket is? And so we maybe need to. And do we need to reassess what's in the basket? And so I want to reflect back on the previous charts that we looked at again. So if we look at these two charts again, we want to see, what's changing. Are things changing? And so nowhere in any of these two charts do I read things like technology. And so what does that mean? Does that mean we're not counting technology? Or maybe it just means that we're adding technology into household operation and furnishings, right? People are buying more technology for their homes. And so maybe, and again, I can't confirm this, maybe household operations and furnishings of that 12.8% in 2017 up from 10% in 1996, maybe that accounts for it, right? And so we want to be sure that the actual basket is a good representation of spending in the future. Because I guarantee you, in 1996, our spending on technology is far different than it is now. And it definitely would be underrepresented if we're only looking at what we did in 1996 and not looking at the current trend of what's happening in terms of spending. So the bottom line is the basket of goods may be inaccurate. Not inaccurate in terms of inaccurately calculated, but inaccurate in terms of you, right? It might not represent your household, like who you are. It might not represent the people in your household, the ages of the people in your household. Like I have neighbors who have 4 kids, right? All of not young kids. They're eating lots. They're doing different things. My daughter's young, and so my spending habits are going to be different. And so we have to understand and be cognizant of that fact. Uh, so why do these limitations matter? And so I alluded to this before with wages, right? Wages being tied to CPI inflation matter. And so maybe you're lucky enough to be able to say, you know what, my employer or my job ties my wages to CPI and inflation. So if inflation happens to be 2.1% this year, there's a guarantee in my contract that my wages will go up at least 2.1%, at least keeping me on track to be on par with my spending from before. And so that's good. But again, if the CPI calculation for inflation does not represent your actual spending habits, then it might not be enough or it might be too much, right? Maybe your spending is a little bit different and the things that you spend on actually went up in price more, or the things that you spend on went up in price less. And so your wages and your livelihood may be tied to this basket of goods that does not represent you, right? You might not be represented properly in terms of how to calculate CPI. And so now we're going to kind of come full circle. So I hope you remember the GDP and output lesson that talked about real GDP versus nominal GDP. And so a short review will talk about nominal GDP being just the GDP, right? Just what is the GDP raw value, right? This This year it might be 1.7 trillion, last year it might be 1.65 trillion. That is raw numbers, right? So that is nominal GDP, okay? Um, this is the output of an economy before any price managing has come out of it, before we account for inflation. And so, why am I bringing this up now? Because we've just been talking about inflation at length with CPI, and so they're going to definitely relate. And so, we always want to get down to a real GDP or a constant dollar GDP for our calculation's sake, right? We want to ensure that our GDP growth rate that we view is real economic activity and not just inflation. We want to have the value of our output after the impact of prices has been removed. And so, how do we do this? How do we remove prices? Well, we use something called the GDP deflator. The GDP deflator is a number that we use to calculate with nominal GDP to create real GDP. And so, this is the equation. Real GDP equals nominal GDP divided by the GDP deflator times 100. Okay, so it's relatively simple. It's not too complicated. So you'll get a value of nominal GDP and you'll get the GDP deflator. And then with those two values, you can calculate real GDP. Okay, and so once you do this, this will nullify or this will remove the impact of price changes. It'll take away inflation in the economic activity equation. So take your pens back out and your calculators back out. And so I want you to calculate the percent change for nominal GDP now. So pause the video. And so hopefully you've all calculated it. And so we'll practice this. And so as a review, the GDP growth rate is just the GDP now minus the GDP before divided by the GDP before times 100%. And so if our nominal GDP in 98 was 901.8 million, our nominal GDP in 99 was 957.9 million, then we can have a GDP growth rate of 6.2%. Okay, fairly simple, but this is just nominal GDP. We can't assume that our economic activity has actually gone up by 6.2%. What if in this past year inflation was 6.2%? Then our actual real GDP growth rate would be zero. So we need to use the deflator and calculate real GDP. And so with our nominal GDP values right here, use those with the GDP deflator values that I'm giving you right now. GDP deflator of 107.9 in 1998 and 108.8 in 1999 is what you need to do. So again, pause the video and go ahead and work on your real GDP calculations. So hopefully you had success in doing that. What is the calculation? So we need to figure out what is real GDP for both of those years. And so hopefully you did this first. Hopefully you try to find out real GDP for 1999. That is a nominal GDP for 1999 divided by the GDP deflator of 1999 times 100. So that value should be 880.42 million. And real GDP for 1998 should be 901.8, which was the previous slide, divided by the 107.1 GDP deflator times 100 gives you 842.02. So the question now is, are we done? And so oftentimes students will go through these calculations, get some values, and think, oh great, I did it, hooray. But look back at what's the actual question. The question is calculate the percent change for real GDP. We haven't actually answered the question yet. You've only calculated real GDP. So now you have to go back and do the growth formula and figure out what did GDP change. So if we use our growth formula, we have 880.42 of 1999 real GDP minus 842.02 divided by 842.02 times 100%. And so that gives us an inflation or a GDP growth rate of 4.62%. This is less than our GDP growth rate for nominal GDP of 6.2% from the previous slide. And so we can see that if you remove prices from this equation, it'll give us a better and more accurate depiction of what GDP growth would have been. So my question for you is, why am I using this in our CPI conversation? And so the question is, what is this deflator? right? If you look at this deflator, the 1998 deflator of 107.1, the 1999 deflator of 108.8, what number is that? Where do I get this? The answer is that number is CPI, okay? That is the actual CPI level because CPI tracks prices. CPI tracks inflation. And so what better use to remove prices from our nominal GDP than to use CPI? Because CPI is what is tracking the prices. And so if you can find CPI, you have your deflator for each year. I hope you enjoyed that lesson. Again, please let me know if you have questions. Send me messages, and I'll hopefully get back to them. I'll get to them as soon as possible. Thank you.